You don't belong in this family." Those words came out of my daughter-in-law's mouth so cleanly, so deliberately, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard her. I hadn't. She said it again, louder this time, in front of everyone at the table. And the worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was that my son said nothing. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old, retired from 31 years as a civil engineer with the city of Ottawa. My wife Margaret passed 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and since then, my son Daniel and his wife Renee have been the closest thing to family I have left. Or so I believed. It started, like most disasters do, with something small. A Sunday dinner at their place in Kanata, the kind that had become routine since Margaret died. Daniel had invited his in-laws, Renee's parents from Mississauga, along with her sister and her husband, a full table, the kind of gathering that should feel warm. I brought wine, a Niagara Peninsula Riesling I'd been saving. I set it on the counter and kissed Renee on the cheek the way I always did, asked if she needed help with anything. She gave me that smile, the one I'd learned over the years was more performance than warmth, and told me to go sit down. The dinner started fine. Her father, a retired insurance broker named Frank, dominated most of the conversation the way he always did, talking about the housing market in Mississauga, about his golf game, about a renovation they were doing on their cottage near Parry Sound. I listened politely. I asked questions. I've always known how to be a guest at someone else's table, even when I was paying a large part of the mortgage on that house. The trouble started when Frank asked about the grandchildren. My grandchildren. Lily was 5 then, and Noah had just turned 3. They'd been running around upstairs, and Renee called them down to say hello to everyone. Lily ran straight to me. She always did. She climbed into my lap before she said hello to anyone else, and I hugged her and told her she'd gotten taller since last week. She laughed and told me that was impossible, because it had only been 7 days. Smart girl, sharp as anything. That's when Renee's mother, Carol, leaned over and said, "Isn't that sweet?" and then looked at Renee with an expression I didn't fully catch. Something passed between them. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room but don't immediately look for the open window. Dinner continued. The wine was poured. Frank made a comment about Ontario wines coming a long way, which I took as a compliment since I'd brought it. Renee barely touched her glass. She seemed distracted, pulling at something just beneath the surface of her politeness. It was when the children had gone back upstairs and the dishes were being cleared that it happened. I made an offhand comment. Something about how I'd been looking into registered education savings plans for Lily and Noah, whether it made sense to increase the contributions given the projections for tuition costs in 15 years. It wasn't a grand announcement. I'd been doing this quietly for years, contributing to their RESPs since each of them was born. I just mentioned it the way you mentioned checking the tire pressure. It's something you do because you care. Renee set down the plate she was holding. Judgy, dudgy. I remember that detail clearly. The sound of ceramic against the counter, harder than necessary. "Gerald," she said, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, at least not directed at me. "You need to understand something. This is our family." She gestured vaguely around the kitchen, encompassing Daniel, the children upstairs, herself, our decisions, our life. We don't need you inserting yourself into every financial conversation. I looked at Daniel. He was studying the tablecloth. "I wasn't inserting myself," I said. "I was mentioning something I've already been doing for years. The accounts are already open. I set them up when Lily was born." "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You do things without asking. You just assume you have a right to be involved. You give money, and then you act like that gives you ownership over everything." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Something quieter than that. I want to be careful describing it because it wasn't what she expected. She expected me to apologize, I think. To backtrack. To reassure her. That was the dynamic she'd been trained on. The one where I absorbed her displeasure and smoothed everything over because the alternative was losing access to my grandchildren. "Gerald," she continued, her voice gaining a kind of momentum, like someone who's rehearsed a speech and finally found the courage to deliver it. "You were never really part of this family. You've been Daniel's father, fine, but you are not our family. You are not Lily and Noah's family. You are a relative we see out of obligation. Frank cleared his throat. Carol looked at the table. Renee's sister stared at her wine glass. Daniel said nothing. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 41 years old. I had coached his hockey team in Nepean for 6 seasons. I had driven him to university in Kingston with a truck full of his things and cried in the parking lot when I drove back alone. I had sat in the waiting room when Lily was born for 9 hours because he'd called me from the hospital and said he needed me there. I had been at every important moment of his life, and he sat at his own dinner table and let his wife tell me I wasn't family, and he said nothing. Well then, I said. I stood up, folded my napkin, and set it beside my plate. Thank you for dinner. I said goodbye to Frank and Carol. I said goodbye to Renee's sister, whose name was Paula, and her husband Kevin. I walked to the hallway, put on my coat, and let myself out. I sat in my car in their driveway for exactly 2 minutes. I wasn't crying. I was thinking. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes from a certain type of hurt, the kind where something you half suspected finally steps into the light. It doesn't feel like shock. It feels like confirmation. I drove home to my house in Barhaven. I made myself tea. I sat at the kitchen table, where Margaret and I had done 1,000 ordinary things together, and I made a list. The RESP contributions for Lily. $400 a month since she was born, 5 years of it. Government matching through the Canada Education Savings Grant. The same for Noah, 3 years in. Combined, I had put in just over $40,000 across both accounts. The help with their mortgage when Renee's mat leave overlapped with Daniel's company downsizing 2 years ago. I had covered 3 months of payments directly. Their mortgage was on a property in Canada that I had also co-signed, because Daniel's credit history wasn't strong enough on his own when they bought in 2018. The minivan. When their old car died and they needed something reliable for the children, I had put $12,000 toward a used Honda Odyssey. A loan, technically, though we'd never discussed repayment in any specific terms. The basement renovation. Their house had a legal secondary suite that they rented out for extra income. I had done the project management on that renovation myself, calling in favors from contractors I'd worked with for decades, saving them an estimated $20,000 in labor costs. I wrote it all down, not because I intended to use it as a weapon, because I needed to see it clearly. I needed to understand what my son's silence had cost me, translated into concrete terms. The next morning I called my lawyer. Her name is Patricia Chen, and she has handled my affairs since Margaret's estate. I told her I wanted to make several changes. I wanted to remove Daniel as the primary beneficiary on my estate and replace him with my niece in Vancouver and a hospice in Ottawa that Margaret had spent time in. I wanted to explore the legal process for removing my name as co-signer from Daniel's mortgage, understanding that would require the bank's cooperation and likely Daniel's refinancing. I wanted to formalize the outstanding loan for the minivan with a proper promissory note, and I wanted to transfer ownership of both RESPs. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She asked if I was sure. I told her I was. I also called my financial advisor that afternoon, a man named Robert at a downtown Ottawa firm I'd used for 15 years. I told him I wanted to redirect my monthly RESP contributions, not cancel them. I have a great niece in British Columbia named Sophie who is 2 years old. The money would go to her instead. These were not impulsive decisions. I want to be clear about that. They were the decisions of a man who had finally been told, plainly and in front of witnesses, what his actual position was. I was not family. I was a relative seen out of obligation. You don't continue financing obligation. Daniel called 4 days later. Dad, what's going on? It wasn't really a question. His voice had that particular tone he gets when he knows he's in trouble, the one I recognized from when he was 16 and had scratched the car. I think you know what's going on, I said. Renee told me what she said. He paused. She was out of line. Was she? Another pause. Dad, come on. She was stressed. Her parents were there. Things got heated. She said things she didn't mean. She said them clearly enough, I replied. In front of 6 adults. Twice. I've already talked to her about it. She feels terrible. I'm glad she feels terrible, I said. But that doesn't change what was said or what I've decided. What have you decided? His voice had shifted slightly. The beginning of real concern. I told him about the RESP changes. I told him about the conversations with Patricia. I didn't raise my voice. I described each change the way you'd describe items on a home inspection report. Factual. Sequential. Here is the current situation. Here is what will change. He was silent for a long time. You can't just cut off your grandchildren because you're angry at my wife. I thought about Lily in my lap at dinner. I thought about Noah calling me Papa Gerald, a name he'd invented himself when he was learning to talk and couldn't manage 2 syllables consistently. Daniel, I said, I'm not cutting off your children. I'm removing myself from a financial arrangement that was based on a relationship your wife has just told me doesn't exist. The two are different things. The relationship does exist. She was wrong to say what she said. Then she should have thought about that before she said it, I replied. In front of her parents, in front of Paula and Kevin, in front of your dinner table. He asked me to come over. I declined. He asked if we could meet for lunch. I told him I needed some time to think clearly, and that I'd be in touch. He didn't push. Daniel has always known when he's run out of road with me. The community response came in stages, the way it does in a neighborhood where people have lived side by side for a long time. My street in Barhaven is the kind where people know each other's cars and wave when they're getting the mail. Margaret had been friends with several of the women nearby, and those friendships had extended to me in the way that a spouse's death sometimes transfers social connection rather than eliminating it. My neighbor Helen was the first to come by. She brought muffins, which is how serious things begin in Ottawa in November. She sat at my kitchen table and told me she'd run into Renee at Costco on Hazeldean, and that Renee had told her there'd been a family misunderstanding, that I was going through a hard time since Margaret, that the family was worried about me. I went through a hard time when Margaret died, I said. That was 6 years ago. Helen nodded slowly. That's what I thought, she said. You seem fine to me. I told her what had actually happened. Not with drama, just the sequence of events. The dinner, the words, the silence from Daniel. She listened the way good people listen, without interrupting, without immediately taking sides, just absorbing it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said you weren't family in front of everyone? Twice, I confirmed. Helen shook her head slowly and didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The picture I got from various people over the following 2 weeks was one I recognized. Renee was running a version of events designed to make her look like the reasonable party in a conflict with a difficult older man. She had told the Costco version to Helen. She had told Paula's version to Paula's mutual friends. She had called Daniel's cousin in Gatineau and told her that I had become erratic and controlling since Margaret's death, that she was trying to protect her children. I heard this version from Daniel's cousin Michelle, who called me directly because she'd known me for 30 years and found the story implausible. Michelle is 47, works in federal government, and has no patience for nonsense. She told me flatly that she didn't believe a word of it and asked what was actually going on. I told her. Michelle was quiet in a very specific way. The kind of quiet that means someone is deciding whether to say the thing they're actually thinking. Gerald, she said finally, can I be honest with you? I told her yes. Renee has never been comfortable with how much Daniel leans on you. She's mentioned it to me before, more than once, the fact that he calls you for advice about things she thinks he should be coming to her about. The fact that the kids are closer to you than to her parents. The fact that you co-signed the mortgage, which means the bank has your name on paperwork for a house she thinks of as hers. I sat with that for a moment. So this was territorial, I said. I think she wanted you to feel small enough to step back, Michelle said. I don't think she expected you to actually leave. That distinction struck me as important. There's a difference between wanting someone to diminish themselves and wanting them gone entirely. Renee had wanted me smaller, more at the margins, less central. She delivered that speech expecting me to absorb it and continue on in a reduced capacity, still providing the financial underpinning while taking up less emotional space. She hadn't expected me to take her at her word. It was 3 weeks after the dinner when Daniel showed up at my door on a Wednesday morning. I could see from the driveway that he hadn't been sleeping well. There's a particular look my son gets when he's been carrying something heavy, a kind of tightness around his eyes. He had it that morning. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with something more complicated. "Dad," he said, "I need to understand what you've actually done. Patricia wouldn't tell me specifics, obviously, but she confirmed that you've made changes to the estate." I told him what I'd told him on the phone, but more specifically this time. Every change, including the RESP transfers to Sophie in Vancouver. He was quiet through all of it. When I finished, he put both hands around his coffee mug and stared at the table. "I owe you an apology," he said. I waited. "I should have said something at dinner." He looked up at me. I knew what she was doing. I'd seen her do versions of it before, but never at that level, never directed at you. And I just sat there. "Why?" I asked. Not with anger. I genuinely wanted to understand. He exhaled slowly. "Because it's easier. Because when I push back on Renee, the fallout lasts for weeks, and I'm the one who has to live in that house. Because I told myself she'd apologize later and it wouldn't matter." He shook his head. I knew that was a lie when I was telling it to myself. That honesty cost him something. I could see it. Daniel has always found it hard to admit when he's failed at something, and what he'd failed at was protecting me, which was not a natural direction for that kind of protection to flow, but it was nonetheless real. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. But it doesn't undo what was said. It doesn't undo 3 weeks of Renee telling people in Costco and on the phone that I've become erratic since your mother died. He winced. "I know. I want you to understand something, Daniel." I looked at him steadily. "I am not doing any of this to punish you. I'm doing it because your wife told me, clearly, what my position in this family actually is. I believed her, and I've made my decisions accordingly." "What would it take," he asked quietly, "to change your mind?" I thought about that for a moment. "Nothing from you," I said. "You didn't say those words. You should have stopped them, and you didn't, and that matters. But the words came from Renee. And the 3 weeks of stories she's been telling people since then, those came from Renee too. So the answer to your question, the only possible answer, is that it would take Renee. Sitting at this table, telling me the truth about what she intended that night and why." Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "She won't do that," he said. "Then we have our answer," I said. He sat for a while longer. We talked about other things eventually. Hockey. The construction on the 416. A book I'd been reading. It was strange and sad and also somehow necessary, the way a reset between two people sometimes requires you to first see each other clearly without the old architecture of assumption. When he left, he stopped at the door. "I'm going to talk to her, Dad." "I know you will," I said. "I'm not sure what she'll do." "I know that too." The meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later. I had not requested it. Daniel called me the Thursday before and told me that Renee wanted to come over. He said she had asked to come alone, without him, which I found interesting. I said that was fine. She arrived at 2 o'clock. She was wearing a coat I recognized, a gray wool one she'd had for years, and she looked like she hadn't slept particularly well either. She stood on my front step with her hands in her pockets, and I noticed she didn't have the particular armored quality she usually carried. Something was missing from her posture. I brought her inside, made tea, because it was November, and it was Ottawa, and that's what you do. We sat at the kitchen table. I let the silence run until she was ready to fill it. "I've been talking to someone," she said finally. "A therapist. I started a few weeks ago, after the dinner." I didn't respond. I waited. She said some things that I've been thinking about. She said that when people attack the people who support them, it's usually because being supported feels threatening somehow, like it means you owe something you can't repay. "That's an interesting observation," I said carefully. Renee looked at me. She had brown eyes, my daughter-in-law, and there was something in them that night I hadn't seen clearly before. Not cruelty, not the performance of the dinner table, something closer to exhaustion. "I've always felt like you were the real foundation of Daniel's life," she said. "His touchstone. He calls you before he calls me sometimes, when something big happens. When we bought the house, when Lily was born, you were the first person he called. Both times." She paused. "I know that probably sounds petty." "It sounds honest," I said. "When you co-signed the mortgage," she continued, And I knew it was because Daniel couldn't do it without you. I told myself it was fine, that it was just practical. But it sat in me somewhere. The fact that this house, the place I'm supposed to feel most myself, has your name on it somewhere. I understood, in that moment, something I hadn't fully understood before. This hadn't been about money or resp accounts or dinner table logistics. It had been about Renee feeling like a guest in her own life, in a marriage whose structural supports ran through someone else. And rather than address that directly with Daniel, she had aimed it at the support itself. That doesn't mean what she said was acceptable. It wasn't. But context is not the same as justification, and I've lived long enough to know the difference. What you said in front of everyone, I told her, was designed to diminish me, to make me small enough that stepping back would feel like my choice rather than yours. She looked at the table. Yes, the word was very quiet. And the 3 weeks after, I continued. The stories you've been telling people. The erratic widower narrative. I know. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I panicked. You actually left, Gerald. I didn't think you would actually leave. I thought you'd be hurt, and then you'd come around because that's what you've always done. And when you didn't, I tried to control what people thought. I'm 64 years old, Renee. I've been in this family for 14 years. I walked Daniel down the aisle. I was in that waiting room for 9 hours when Lily was born. I know. I told you once when Noah was sick, and you were both terrified that I would be there for whatever they needed. Do you remember that? She nodded. Her eyes were wet now. I meant that, I said. I meant every version of it. And you looked me in the eye in front of your parents and your sister and told me I was not your family. The silence stretched. I'm sorry, she said. And it was different from the rehearsed kind of apology. It was the kind that comes out small and insufficient because the person saying it has finally understood the actual size of what they've done. I looked at this woman my son had chosen to build his life with, this woman who was raising my grandchildren, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Grief. More than anger. Grief for the version of this family that might have existed if she had come to me years ago and said simply, I feel like an outsider in my own marriage sometimes, and I don't know how to talk to Daniel about it. I would have listened. I would have helped. That was always the kind of help I was most capable of giving and most willing to give. Not just money and co-signatures and RESP contributions. Presence. Steadiness. Someone who'd been through enough to know how to sit with hard things. I don't know if I can put everything back the way it was, I told her finally. Some of the changes I've made are permanent. The estate is what it is. The RESP contributions for Sophie are going to continue. She nodded. She didn't argue. But Daniel is my son, I said, and Lily and Noah are my grandchildren. Those facts don't change regardless of paperwork or dinner conversations. What changes is the terms. She looked up. The terms are that I am not a financial infrastructure. I am a person, a grandfather, a father. I will be present in this family the way a person is present, not the way a utility is present. Do you understand the difference? Yes, she said. I need you to mean that, I told her. Not for me, for them. Because the day will come when Lily and Noah are old enough to understand what happened in that kitchen, and the story they carry from it will be shaped by what you do in the years between now and then. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. There was nothing performative about it. I'll do better, she said. I don't know how to promise more than that right now. That's enough for now, I said. She left an hour later. Not reconciled in the way that word usually gets used, where everything is reset and the difficult thing is placed in a box and closed. But something had shifted. An honest thing had been said. That has its own kind of weight. Daniel called me that evening. How did it go? He asked. I told him it was a beginning. He was quiet for a moment. I heard him exhale. I know I let you down, he said. At dinner, I'm going to spend a long time working on that. You should, I told him. Not because you owe me something, because the people in that house are watching how you handle things, including Lily. She pays attention to more than you realize. He laughed a little. She does. You're right. I know I'm right. She told me last week that she'd noticed I hadn't been coming over, and she'd asked her mother why. Renee told her Papa Gerald was busy. What did Lily say to that? She told her mother that Papa Gerald was never too busy for them. Daniel was quiet. Smart girl, he said finally. Sharp as anything, I agreed. I won't tell you that everything that followed was easy. It wasn't. Trust is not a switch you flip. It's a thing you rebuild the way you renovate a house that's had some structural damage, carefully, room by room, checking your work as you go. There were dinners that were stiff. There were conversations that ran out of road before they got anywhere. There were moments when I looked at Renee across the table and felt the echo of what she'd said, and had to make a deliberate choice about what to do with it. But Lily still climbs into my lap when I arrive. Noah still calls me Papa Gerald. And the story I carry from all of it is this. The people who love you will sometimes say the worst possible thing. The question is not whether you forgive them. The question is whether they understand what they've actually done, and whether they're willing to do the work of becoming someone who doesn't do it again. I am 64 years old. I have lived through loss, and I have lived through the particular loneliness of being a widower in a world built for pairs. I know what it means to have family, and I know what it means to lose it. I was not willing to lose any more without first making sure everyone understood the cost. If you found something true in this story, please subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments. And when you're ready for the next one, it's right there waiting for you.